So keen that it's an open discussion, really, rather than just feeling like a sort of Q&A. That's dramatic. So we do have, we'll make sure we check in with people online. But yeah, anyone want to start us off with a question or reflection on what you've heard? Feel free to chip in if there's stuff in your well. Yep.
I've got a question. So it's a bit dry for the first question. I was going to ask about like the funding for these sorts of schemes. Like typically it's much more concentrated on sort of capital funding and the need to perhaps show leave money in a certain way, which might lend itself towards sort of those sort of more transformational interventions like a modal filter or a crossing where you can really say, oh, this resulted in an increase in walking and cycling. But then also on that point around those really small scale interventions that are needed and often like maintenance issues as well as sort of changes and that kind of thing. So I wonder if there's any discussion with that sort of central government funding stream around like looking at different ways of funding these projects, so like revenue funding instead rather than capital or a mix of both, perhaps doing a bit of revenue funding as part of trials to show benefit early on. I don't know. Yeah. Open to sort of question discussion point really.
Yeah, it's a key question and it's a key challenge. Do you want to?
Yeah, just so to start off with, completely. We're very beholden to rounds of funding and capital funding, and 3-year settlements if we're lucky, or 5 years at the absolute most. And that's why maintenance is so tricky and such a hard one for us, because even when there is revenue pots, and there is sometimes from central government, they're usually much more focused on small little projects and delivering those rather than not maintenance type things at councils. And we all know that like council budgets being slashed, and that is the really hard thing to focus on. I think I'm not aware of any discussions on that particular front, but I think it would be really useful and something that we should be looking into it and pushing for. Because we find there's, the research shows that it's so important, these little things about curbs and maintenance and upkeep, but it's really hard. Selling that story. Maybe more on the appraisal side you could answer.
I guess from like thinking about an evaluation perspective and kind of making the case, like it'd be really kind of useful to weigh up like all these small things, like small costs, and maybe there isn't a budget associated with them, but if you do them, what is that benefit, and quantify that, and then you can kind of use that to potentially make the case for changing how it works currently. And I think if you think about things like, sometimes it's like a mindset thing, so I'm just thinking this is more from like a gender perspective than like age and disability, but the whole thing about winter like snow clearance, and in certain countries they clear the pavements first because they've kind of looked into it from an equality perspective. So there's that thing around putting more of an equality lens. So, sorry, I'll speak up.
Yeah, and I would certainly echo all of that, and I would say that it's to give some hope because it is an ongoing conversation that takes place, with local authorities and with Transport for Greater Manchester, in how we lobby the government for more revenue, both designed into any schemes. We've got a pot of funding for something like, an active neighbourhood, that's factored in so you can do far better, involve people from the very beginning, not just then seeking to activate it at the end and not do the co-design, which takes time. It takes people, it takes building trust. But then also, I think is it capabilities funding? There's a couple of big pots at the moment, and it really is pushing and working back to Travel England to make sure that all what they describe as often soft stuff around behaviour change is really invested in, and it isn't just about the hard infrastructure, because otherwise we'll continue to get the backlash that we've been getting because people see it as incongruous, and one minute they've got kind of a cycle lane being built but their pavements aren't accessible, things feel like they're being done to them, not done with them, they don't necessarily meet their needs, and they're patchy and not connected. So we need to continue to lobby, but I am personally seeing shifts. And also then within local authorities, I think where it works well, you then have your highways team works hand in glove with your neighbourhoods team, so things like, to that point, prioritisation around what I see. I would say I get much quicker responses now to saying we need to grit, and clear the cycle lanes and the pavements, because of the greater understanding now of those inequities and of the fact that for a long time we have been so car-centred in everything, but we've still got a way to go to shift that. Really important. It's a great question.
One of the themes that have come through about is working with people and co-design and all that sort of thing. Now, I've been following people who've been discussing council, which is quite well, resident of a very large impact. And his view was that if you get a group of residents, the overall effect is to suppress innovation. Whereas you could say at the moment, in changing times, we need innovation more than more than any other time before. Would you like to comment on that? View that residents are not a different attitude towards residents and vision.
So local residents don't support innovation.
The theory is that there are so many differing views that they tend to prevent other views coming forward. In other words, the continual variation is suppressing any innovation they need. So what actually happens is they tend to, in a sense, vote for the status quo rather than going for change, even though if you take a different approach, you might reveal that change is necessary. So
change can be hard. Any reflections?
That is true. That's a psychological mechanism in groups. When you graduate towards them, your outliers are eradicated effectively because they convince them that their ideas are too radical. So yeah, it's a difficult balance, but I don't know what the answer is.
I was just going to reflect. I know one of the recommendations was around citizen panels, and I know in other areas where they've used citizen panels where you have a lot of time to kind of bring experts in and take time with people to have those like really in-depth discussions, and that tends to lead to more radical responses from what I understand.
I mean, where you have, I suppose, a relatively simple problem, but very differing views, citizens panel can solve that. I mean, you think in terms of in Ireland, the decision on that, it's very much divided, if you took it's very, very split, but they actually managed to come to a decision. But that, in one sense, is taking two outliers, most people seem to be congregating there, and finding some balance in the middle ground. But if your things you need are radical, if you want to solve air quality issues, for instance, with slightly to one side, we will need a radical step. But what we're seeing from London is that people are trying to, in a sense, come back to status quo now. So,
I mean, certainly we'll see it, don't we? And one of the things that's been helpful in this board, we used to do the whole kind of what's the cost of doing nothing. And I find that both at the local level as well, in Chorlton, so residents on Monday around the local school street, and it's, people get so caught into the thing that's happening at a very granular level in front of their, that feels like a change, that feels annoying, they lose sight of the, if we do nothing, we're heading towards complete climate breakdown, we can't breathe the air in, we're going to have more cars on our streets. All these things, and when you go back, it is back to taking the time to go in, what is it that is the common ground that we all want? We all want healthier, greener, safer places to live that are pro-social and accessible, but that takes time to have. You have to have the vision, you have to have the time to go, what's the problem, what things you want, how does that connect to what we're trying to do, and then how are we going to get there? And I think that's when we start to see opportunities for more radical change. And I think that's been part of the problem, hasn't it? People haven't had that part of the journey. They've just suddenly seen things they feel are taken away from them or being done to them. And that's come out certainly in the Active Neighbourhoods research that was done before as well. So how do we make innovation a point? So Alan, and then you can ask, I'm sure I've got some women coming to you as well. So Alan.
Can I just introduce myself to speak?
I failed.
So my name is Andrews, everyone. I'm managing director of the Community Interest Company, and we help to make mainstream provision more accessible for disabled people. And I was one of the P's on the board early, so I was involved in the consultation. So anything around disabled people and access, happy to sort of answer any questions.
Thank you.
Great.
Of course, and I just assume everybody knows who you are, which is failing you completely. Thank you. Alan.
Thank you. I was very struck by something that Eve said in her presentation, which is certainly in large parts of Manchester, in the interwar developments, where there was a very specific attempt, very deliberate attempt to create what we would now call low traffic area, which would be paraded shops, the butchers, the greengrocers, hardware store, local school, the clinic, the doctors, etc., etc. Now there are parts of South Manchester where you've got to get 2 buses to get to a greengrocers, where you can't get on an NHS dental list. So it seems to me that there's that impact. There's a really kind of critical dimension that isn't just about geography, and it isn't just about engineering solutions, it's about some of those social conditions, about how do you support businesses. And part of the solution might be the Great National Living Wage, making sure people have got the spending power in on councils to be able to support the greengrocers and the butchers and the bakers and the chemists makers and so on. So it seems to me that my worry is that there are times when the narrative around low traffic neighbourhoods sounds like it's the kind of the hipster artisan sourdough shop that's 10 minutes away from my loft apartment, which would be great. And I live 10 minutes from my local vegan whole food cooperative as it is. But I'm just saying there is that other dimension to it that I think is kind of quite really difficult. But I think unless we actually think about that, we are going to lose some of the impact.
So both narrative, I guess, what you hear and think it means, but also the wider placemaking. Any reflections?
Well, that was in that is in the report. That idea of gentrification is seen as nice as it is, can be a problem because a lot of people, older and disabled people, who are a greater part of our population now, don't want or feel comfortable actually in those kind of places. So we have to be mindful of when we're building neighbourhoods and building communities, what is in there. Absolutely. We want to make nice places, but it doesn't necessarily mean gentrification.
I think it and I don't know what areas you're talking about, but the estate that was the research I was talking about was actually, and I despise the term, but it's the term we all know, it was originally what was referred to as a slum clearance estate, and there's quite a lot of these estates that are on the peripheries of areas, and that's a real issue in geography. So they, like you say, they were originally designed, and it was a brand new world, all singing, all dancing, had everything that they needed, not just in the township, but in the estates themselves, where they were designed and mapped out. Everyone had a shop, there was a community centre, and then over time, they really lost those spaces, but they're actually geographically quite disconnected as well. So I think some of the residents I spoke to would say, never mind sourdough, I just want to get a bus to work, which I can't because I'm out here, I'm out here. And there's quite a lot of those estates and neighbourhoods now that end up on the periphery. And like you say, it wasn't just about I can't get a bus and there's no bank anymore. It was that social connection, the real difficulty of how do I get to know people, how do I understand, connect with them. Yeah, well, it's not really an answer, I was just violently agreeing.
We try and resolve our kind of economic model by which we end up with, we've gone from 4 banks, Alan, to maybe 3 in Chorlton, which is, as an example, and where what's seen as being the economic driver is, yes, more bars, more things, a high turnover, as opposed to some of the local services that actually meet local needs. Where you used to be able to go and buy your pants and your socks and your shoes locally, you often can't in a lot of those communities anymore. So it is key, and a lot of the community space has been stripped out as well because they're too expensive. So it's a big challenge there. I'm going to come to Hayley, and I've got one more, and I can come back.
I was only going to answer that.
Okay, go on, you can answer all of it.
Very quickly, that was the estate originally viable? But as more people, like a portion of people start travelling by car to Tesco's or whatever, the services are slowly becoming unable to compete. They cling on maybe. Once they're closed, you can't restart them. It's not the 15-minute neighbourhood concept. Wouldn't that, to a certain extent, at least helping, begin to enable those services to come back, switching the balance? So probably supporting the services has to go hand in hand with altering your transport or social way of doing things.
Yeah, can I respond? Because there is a about enabling mobility. If you enable people to drive, what you do is take them out to their communities. There was an example, there's a paper, I think, did we quote it? You obviously not. But there was a community in South America where they didn't have public transport into the city. So their local community was thriving because they couldn't get to the jobs that were in the city. So they had to have those opportunities and those jobs and those amenities, within their little town. So there is an issue that by enabling mobility, you can sometimes cause more damage.
A lot of linked to what I was going to say, a lot of stuff that's already been mentioned, but one thing that I'm really aware of is the kind of conflict between trying to regenerate precincts and town centres to get people shopping more locally and the sheer astronomical cost of business rates and getting independent people in shops or reopening greengrocers and those kind of local sort of amenities that these sort of neighbourhoods are supposed to thrive upon. I'm working currently in Hyde town centre in Tameside, which is very close to Hastley, which is one of those kind of slum clearance, for want of a better phrase, estates, which is very like a satellite these days, and transport is poor in the main. But what I've kind of struggled with is I'm working with Manchester Bike Kitchen, doing a lot of work in and around to kind of like cycling and getting people active, which has been really, really successful. But the kind of logistical and monetary nightmare of trying to get them a base to work out of within that centre, and it's been massively well received by the public, but they're in a shopping centre that's probably 50% vacant, so it's kind of quite challenging how you can get people to come back into town centres, make those kind of low traffic areas where people can be pedestrians, people paying for the transport. When I've found a lot of low traffic neighbourhoods are actually used as a way of reducing rat running, which is totally what I'm for, but not necessarily to enable people to walk to the shop or get to the hairdressers or whatever. It's more about making it safer for people to maybe walk and cycle on that street, but that's not actually connected to a precinct or a social space. It's more of a walking off one end of the street so people know to through or people playing out or whatever. So it's just, I think it's kind of difficult from someone who kind of works in a local authority to kind of champion these neighbourhoods when a lot of residents see them as either punitive measures, so stopping cars or whatever, or being unable to kind of encourage regeneration because the cost of doing that is too high. And are there any plans to kind of link that funding where we're trying to enable these neighbourhoods with kind of that regeneration or that business kind of support or whatever moving forward? I know it's a big question, but it's kind of, I just feel that that's a real missing link, because in order to enable these things to happen, you need that to be built.
I think kind of going back to some of the research and what was coming out of that was saying how important it is about these local communities and these centres, and that goes back to how we're defining the neighbourhood, and maybe we're not looking at. It's tricky, isn't it? Because we want an area that's we can do something that's meaningful, that's not too large, etc., and makes sense geographically, etc. But maybe we are a little bit sometimes, something we'll learn from, that we need to be making more of those connections and thinking about what actually where people are trying to get to a bit more. The neighbourhood, how we define that neighbourhood.
And just to add to that, I think what you've said really relates to what the first phase of this research found, which is that active neighbourhoods were often seen in isolation, but in practice there might have been wider plans to connect them up, and the overview plan is everywhere is accessible by walking cycling, but that wasn't very communicated or clear when like the work was happening in the neighbourhood. And then the second thing I was just going to quickly mention, this is more like a larger town centre, but some of the wider walking and cycling schemes are tying in what they're doing with local kind of regeneration and economic stuff. Like, for example, in Oldham, they've got like a big thing called Accessible Oldham, and part of that is being a challenge for walking and cycling. They've also got a lot of wider plans around regeneration as well.
Yeah, Stockport as well. So the underbanks in Stockport have been regenerated, and that's been been closed to motor traffic around the cathedral, the church, and the market. So, and all that area now is being regenerated. So yeah, they can go hand in hand. I think but you're right. It's we need to think of active neighbourhoods as part of specifically where they are in relation to what people need and what they want to get to.
They'll get more back from residents if they feel like they're at the forefront, because I think a lot of objections are coming from those people who feel like they're being penalised for using the easiest way of getting around, which is usually four wheels, unfortunately, in that area.
There was a question at the back, and then I've got Wayne. Oh no, okay, great.
It was a script observation. I don't know whether it's stupid because I don't feel well run enough. We're all talking a little bit about active neighbourhoods and how maybe we should be saying active streets when it's just about the street use. If we're including neighbourhood concept, we need to include the amenities with that. And it has been done on a case-by-case basis. I'm aware of vans going around with ledge and stuff like that. But I just scribbled down reclaimed road space for mobile amenities. Right? The road space is the thing we're reclaiming. That's the space that, in theory, is available without having to go through business rates and so on and so forth. And it will be on a case-by-case basis. I don't know whether there's examples of where that's being tried.
Good question. Any trials? Anyone know of anything? Anyone here or elsewhere?
It's a little bit different, but part of the third space is in my PhD research wasn't necessarily the road, but it was actually vacant common land. So it wasn't just buildings. It was flats once upon a time that had gone. And they were very much incorporated into the use of the neighbourhood for activities. And I don't think probably unofficial selling out of vehicles, but not. It was really well used because it was just owned by the estate. The children played on it, and activities were on it. It was just like this very natural space, yeah. And then more houses which were needed, and people did want. It lost that organic space, so I haven't seen it with streets as such in that way, but definitely that sort of common space that you sometimes find in neighbourhoods. Yeah.
But that does kind of relate to that point about the tension between car access, the cars being a barrier, but giving them access as well, because increasingly people are having stuff delivered. So where do we draw that line?
There's probably some learning from more rural communities as well, where you're more likely to have your mobile libraries, etc., come to you. Things that we used to have but maybe taken away, as well as having stuff coming through by cargo bike then rather than by other means. So I've got Louise. Then we're going to go online and to the front. So Louise.
Yeah, going back to the reflection anime that TFGM reflecting that active neighbourhoods are being defined by engineers looking at transport problem, safe traffic volumes, etc. And it's great that the research provides some supporting evidence to define active neighbourhood through a social lens and hopefully through a community design definition. So drawing on that being in place, are there any thoughts from the panel on how we can cascade and share that more broadly and essentially support our local colleagues to think in this way, and let's say we define a community active neighbourhood in a different way using shops, amenities and social spaces, how then it gets prioritised in the pipeline schemes, because we've got to measure against different set of metrics.
And just so much in that interface between local authorities and TFGM and us and communities that you've got.
I think part of it for now, I think all the conversations are sort of aligning. I think we are heading down that route. I think part of it is just patience and just trying to keep the conversation going. Keep that's how culture change happens. You just have to keep repeating the same thing over and over again, basically. I think then we've just got to sweep with some of that and keep doing what we're doing. So yeah, not a very good answer, Lou, but I do think I'm quite optimistic in that the same conversations that used to be quite segregated and sit with specialists and little quirky rooms not dissimilar to this really are now happening in more mainstream places, like the big active conversation and stuff like that. So they're on a mainstream stage, and yeah, I'm quite hopeful that eventually we will get there.
Hold on to that hope. Question online?
Yeah, two. So they're quite different. Shall we just do them together?
Yeah, go on.
So one from Sarah Rowe. What are the barriers to doing good community consultation other than money? And what could or should civil society be doing to help with this? Another one from Sarah Hassan about the role of public transport in supporting goals to achieve healthier, more sustainable living, in particular in relation to the 15-minute neighbourhood. So how does public transport relate to the 15-minute neighbourhood? I think that's the question, yeah.
Great questions.
I can come on I think the barriers consultation. I think consultation I've got a love-hate relationship with it really, because I think if consultation is purposeful, what Eve's doing, where it is real community-based engagement, and we need to know what you want from your community. You live here, you are best placed to advise on that type of stuff. I think that's fair. I think the barriers that come along with that is truly engaging people along all aspects of that journey at every single point, and not coming in saying, we've got this idea for your neighbourhood, but working with people and saying, what do you want from your neighbourhood? And then the team's enabling that. I think other aspects of consultation can feel a bit forced sometimes and a bit tick boxer. So we have a lot of consultations around how we can make places more accessible for disabled people, for example. And a lot of that research, a lot of the resources to tell us what the best placement is for a Hussein or a Bollard, it's already out there. So we sort of regurgitating the same information across the country for disabled people being involved in that. They might not particularly be experts in that space, they're experts through lived experience, but I don't think the expectation should be on them to come up with these types of solutions. A lot of the evidence is already out there. So I think that might be a barrier sometimes, that we sort of repeating the same conversations. Disabled people have been asked the same questions again year after year, and I think that is a real barrier sometimes. So for me, it's about looking at what we've already got available, what insight do we already have, and using that rather than trying to regurgitate the same stuff. So,
I think on consultations and certainly the experience of active neighbourhoods, it's that one of the barriers is that initial phase, and that getting the buy-in initially or getting the involvement from the community. And I guess it's having those leads and that understanding of the community and who the best people to go to are to really engage in loads of different groups. And to be honest, it's probably, yes, it does come a little bit back down to money. I know that was one of the things that it said to excluding money, but it's the time and the resource up front to really work out where we need to be focusing our efforts and where we have where we should put resources, what we should be tapping into, etc. Because I think we do find that, like I said before, when a plan lands, when I think that's when placements of things, that's when you really start to find the engagement. But I also think that like local councillors can be really important on this, local politicians, because they know their communities really well, and maybe that's a more positive part of the solution to get them fully engaged and board initially. They then help spread that message.
That's one of the challenges as well, is often if you literally have funding that is coming in with agreed KPIs at the end, and then you say we're going to consult you, but actually there's no flexibility in practice to change it, and then you further erode trust because people are consulted but actually going ahead with the same thing. So it's how we have to get different funding that is going to facilitate co-design, because it actually has the flex in it to adapt to what you then hear people genuinely want and what matters to them, which is a real challenge.
I think the definition of consultation as well, we really need to define that. Like some people say if consulting is literally giving out information, and some people use consultation and say we've completely co-designed something. So I think there's inconsistency in how we're interpreting what consultation actually means and how that should be taking place.
We're moving conference next Friday and move up our ladder of co-production, where we're going to do just that. There was a question around citizens then, so what can citizens do? And then there was a question around kind of public transport. Pick up the citizens one. You naive. He looked at me.
I think in terms of the consultation, you find that citizens are already normally out there doing something, or that was my experience, and for the consultation to meet them where they already are, if that makes any sense. A lot of consultation working events that I've seen are come to meet us in this really dry space at a really dead inconvenient time that doesn't fit in with your life, and tell us that you really like the idea that we've already decided on. Whereas there's a lot going out there in the community anyway, so if you just went out to people, but I think it does come back sometimes to that trust of people saying, look, we've told you, please just do something. And I think you've got to build on showing what you have done, or explaining why you can't do it, to build that trust to sort of go round then. So I don't think it's as much on citizens at the moment as it is on agencies coming together, but that's just my take.
Transport one.
Going back to your point about, you know, KPIs at the end and already deciding, and that goes back to this idea of the appraisal and how we analyse schemes, and, you know, the pressure we're under sometimes to get a BCR, you know, a positive value for this business case, and get it submitted, and then what economics and what analysis goes into that, and that's such an important part, and there's a long way to go on that front.
But when value for money is still assessed as not really being about environmental or social kind of impact, then we're stuck, aren't we, when we're saying that that's one of the most important things that matter to people. So public transport, when we're talking about integrated network here, we're all advocates of public transport as much as we are for active travel.
What was the question again?
It's the role of public transport in 15-minute neighbourhoods.
Well, the idea is that they sit within it. You know, the public transport links sit within it. But again, going back to that point about mobility sometimes being detrimental, there is a point that if you design a 15-minute neighbourhood and your public transport links sit within that, your jobs aren't on the same public transport links. You've got to ensure that those public transport links within that 15-minute neighbourhood are going to the jobs as well as as where people want to go. So I think that's these guys down the end. It's your fault. Well, the integration is a massive part of that, isn't it?
Yeah.
So if you've integrated the whole network, including cycling and cycle hire and e-scooters and the whole mix, then it means you can get anywhere and you can get to the jobs. So
not just jobs, but also to friends, family, all the other things that matter to us. Which
I was going to add a couple of things quickly. In some other research that we've done, which was specifically talking about walking, one of the things that people did mention was if public transport was more accessible or cheaper, it would actually increase their walking, because they'd be able to kind of maybe get public transport one way and then walk the other way. And then I was also going to mention, in terms of how public transport can help with health, I don't have the stat in my head to hand, but I know in London quite a big proportion of Londoners get their required levels of physical activity just from using public transport, and those walking or cycling to and from public transport are part of those.
I think some of it goes back to what you were both saying about making neighbourhood spaces a bit more affordable and accessible for local businesses and employers, because the focus, the stress is always on the defend you guys on the public transport. There's often a focus that mobility is often that you move away, you get out of certain areas, you work in a different place. Whereas if we, like you two were both saying, if we try to bring things back and make things more attractive in that local area, then that puts less stress on attempting to travel across several different areas, doesn't it? But I haven't got an answer to that. Just sort of,
I was just going to add on a TFGM kind of front branding thing. The destination, the V network. The whole point is it's meant to be an integrated transport system. What we're looking for in Greater Manchester. So it's a seamless transition between walking, cycling, then get on a bus, Metrolink, and bringing this all into one. Much more like London style. I know that's banded around a lot. Transport system that is all integrated. So that's what we're aiming for, but. Long way off,
I did not mean to imply that was not possible.
It's possible. We've seen it, and we're going to make it all. Guy in the blue jumper, in a grey jumper, and then I'll come into you, Terry.
Thanks very much. Very interested to hear any experience and examples of where these walkability concepts have been transferred to more rural areas, or certainly outside of larger city examples. Thinking of that particularly because some of the oldest communities in the north are predominantly rural areas, and social exclusion linked to transport does tend to be concentrated in smaller towns outside of the major conurbations. So very interested to hear how these can be transferred and the same benefits can be experienced in more rural areas.
Did you look at that at all in your research?
It doesn't. There was something I stumbled upon that, yeah, for rural communities, the question whether you can apply it actually, because yeah, public transport links to rural communities are generally quite poor, and this is that that tension between how much car access do we permit in rural communities. Yeah, it can be life changing in a way, but there's also a movement, and a lot of local authorities in those rural communities, in small towns, market towns particularly, and there's loads of examples of this, where the centre is effectively become a car park because everyone drives into that tiny little town. So, yeah, I think it's something to work out, that you need to allow that access and that use of the car, but I think that there's still possibly the application of an active neighbourhood or a 50-minute neighbourhood within the actual centre of those communities.
One thing, I guess, again, I think where we can learn sometimes from all communities, they have far more community transport. So with some of those routes we're talking about, where currently, and so it will change as we have obviously more publicly controlled our bus network in terms of not just the not for profit, but for people. But there's still a question, I think, about when you've got some of those hyper-local journeys, particularly probably for all of us as we're ageing, and for more disabled residents, where you are talking about journeys that actually maybe as a social enterprise or as a community group, you might be really well placed to host those and to manage that, and you might have smaller buses. But sometimes I think, what are the things that we can learn actually from rural communities that they actually do quite well that maybe we don't do more locally. I'm going to come to Terry, and then
so I suppose I just wanted to really quickly, ironically, about this transfer from out of the car onto public. Sulphur Crescent to Atherton to get home to Lee. How long on public transport do you think it did take, and how long do you think it should take? It actually took nearly 2 3/4 hours. So, I've stood at the bus stop on Bolton Road near the train station going, is it any wonder people don't want to get out of their cars? But actually look at how that affects people like myself who have no option but to use public transport. But my point really was, and I get around engagement and consultation, and I find it, I think unfortunately you're going to end up with usual suspects like myself, like Ben, and like Pete sat behind me, because the people that blind and partially sighted people that I speak to are saying, what's the point? The information is not accessible to me. And again, I had a leaflet put through my door to say that they were doing a cycle lane near where I live, and I didn't even realise, and I've got some useful vision, I didn't even realise, I just thought it was a flashy leaflet advertising something, until my daughter said, oh Mum, it's a cycle lane. I thought, what? It got on to Wigan, and to be fair, I managed through the major projects team to end up to speaking to the contractor, and then had I not spoken to that contractor, that route that's important for me to take my guide dog for a free run would have become totally inaccessible. But he made some adjustments to that. But what I wanted to say was, and again Ian made reference to that, the provision of tactile consultation documents, and yes, ultimately there is a cost. Everyone wants to be paid respectfully for their specialist time, don't they? It doesn't make good business sense to do that. But the model of good practice that I want to quote for you is that Salford City Council did it and had someone say it was the most accessible consultation that they'd ever been involved in 40 years of involvement. And a lady who's one of our volunteers who's now retired, actually accessed Cumbria County Council's redevelopment of the Banstead Junction in Whitehaven, and they commissioned again the tactile consultation documents. And from being able to, saying, I don't understand it, I just can't orientate myself around what you're describing. Once she was able to feel though that data, Cumbria County Council will now say that those consultation documents, actually, as a consequence of her input, that junction became more accessible than the original, than the original design. So if you are listening to communities, the problem is that blind and partially sighted people are a small minority of any single community you go into. 75% of the 80,600 people that are living with sight loss across Greater Manchester are going to be people over the age of 50. So there's some intersectionality in that. And we are an ageing population. So it's about future proofing. And those people aren't necessarily going to be identifying as experiencing sight loss because they're struggling with practical and emotional things around coming to terms with, etc., etc. So really concerned about the disempowerment, disengagement, and also the fact that those people, finding it difficult to navigate in a changing environment as well. I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Really, really good points and some good indicators to think of what good or better will look like. It's only won't take you 2 hours and 15 minutes to get from Lee to here, when we've got a better integrated transport network.
Just comment on the cost.
I
think because Teddy makes a really good point, and cost comes up a lot around how can we make resources more accessible, whether it be tactile, whether it be audible, whatever it might be. But the risk is that if they're not put across in an accessible format, the build is done, and people can be sued if it's not accessible. It has to be ripped up and redesigned again. So when people argue the cost of developing a tactile resource, which is fairly low, comparison to having to rework a whole scheme again, so just sort of keeping it in mind around when that comes up around cost.
Sorry, really quick. And what we are concerned about is, and it's across the country, so I'm not targeting TFGM, Greater Manchester solely, is we are very concerned that the equality impact assessments or diversity impact assessments, whatever you want to recall them, one, they very rare. We can look at them, and when they are released to this, and there seems to be a significant reluctance around local authorities, etc., to release the equality impact assessments and the road safety audits. But quite often we can look at it and go, there's no consideration been taken around the needs of blind and partially sighted people.
Any examples? I know you've done quite a lot with Salford and Trafford and others about, I guess, what good, anything good, and what do we need to spread and grow?
Yeah, so I think in Trafford, and this is something probably to take away for this presentation, they've called their new strategy, and it's only a small win, but it's a walking, wheeling and cycling strategy. And straight away they've got imagery of wheelchair users in there, they've got people using trikes, and that imagery, people seeing that document and seeing that they've been included and considered is really powerful. And then how that translates into infrastructure, that by including those images, by including that terminology, they're sort of endorsing that we are, as a community, going to really prioritise making our spaces accessible. So that's a really good one. Salford Council infrastructure team, we did some work a few years back on Chapel Street East. I'm a local resident as well, and that's sort of the area that I live in. So that was really interesting around how we can basically the complexities of trying to make something accessible for everyone. It is really difficult, even within the disabled community. We talk about tactile paving for blind people, absolute nightmare for some wheelchair users and people with mobility issues. We talk about raised curbs for people who might use canes. It indicates when you're coming up to a curb. Again, if we have that too high, it means that wheelchair users can't get up. But the fact that these type of issues are being explored shows that there's more interest in this area, and we are getting closer to coming to a resolution, a consensus, whatever you want to call it. But it is difficult. It's just finding a happy medium.
Just to add to that, I think with the new commissioner, she does have a very strong focus on accessibility, and we are being pushed on, a lot of our schemes, rightly so, about some of these issues. And so, yeah, it's something that hopefully, will grow in the future and will be making much attention to it, and probably will still be all of us improvements, but it's something that more is being discussed on that front.
Yeah, no, it definitely feels like, I mean,
Yeah.
I don't know, I'm sure a few people was there from the Big Active conversation. That was a mainstream event where accessibility just run all the way through it. That was a real clear voice, and there's guidance coming out, Streets for All guidance, which we're sort of supporting in some ways through the GM Moving Commitment to Inclusion Active Travel Group, where we get planners, engineers, architects in a room with disabled people and disabled-led organisations to come to how can we make this work, both sides. So there is definitely a
question here, and then I think it's going to be the last one there.
But you sort of answered the question. It was about the role of community transport. I think it's not just something in rural communities. It's very real. I think one of the first meetings I was in GM when Brennan was speaking to the GM Older People's Network was about community transport, and actually he got a little bit of the wrong end of the stick, and he got it from 100 people in the room, but it was very much that this is being gutted in lots of areas. There is good examples in HMO circles, things that have happened in local areas. I remember when the recreation centre in Hume was being redone, they had to get people to Huff End, but it took quite a bit of, there was a van available, but making that available to do this to help people, and that was all the People's Network that was there to do it, once we got disabled people. But I think that's a missing piece often, and that is not considered, whereas that can be done at the local levels in ways that work for people.
That's HMR Circle in Rochdale. Yeah, great.
Haywood, Middleton, Rochdale.
Rochdale, thank you. Place matters, identity matters. Yeah, perfect. Yeah, question.
So I'm Jo Bennett. I work with the Active Lifestyle Team for Community Leisure, and it's on. I've worked there 20 years in Community Leisure, and originally was in post-promoting walking. So it's lots of meetings like this for 20 years, listening to quite similar things, the same things 20 years ago. So coming from a physical activity, we're an exercise on referral scheme, but we also coordinate the Rambles Wellbeing Walks. And there was no walking, there wasn't much walking in Salford 20 years ago. Broke down that perception, trying to go in a car to drive to the Lake District to do a ramble with your rucksack and everything else. So, and then obviously lockdown and things like that really helped that, going from your doorstep walking. And all this is great, and all this change and trying to help make neighbourhoods accessible. But at this moment in time, for that person, that's how it is. Manchester's massive, Salford's massive. Yep, this is all going to happen over time, hopefully, and every area is going to be an active neighbourhood. But for the moment, that person that wants to try and get out, the people we work with, it's like trying to look at that person as an individual person. And we've worked together, haven't we? We've done the Go Jointly app, and we looked at all routes for that, and that was in lockdown, wasn't it? We were doing that. Yes. And what's accessible, what, for this person, that person with this wheelchair, this mobility issue. So you can't, it's so difficult to help everybody, but it's looking at that individual person. If I get a referral and they want to walk a bit more, having that discussion around where, how, which of our routes we've got within the wellbeing walks that are fully accessible and can get the wheelchair around. And not everything fits everybody, does it? But at the moment, to help people get active, you've got to look at what you've got, what you can access on your doorstep, and help them get away through that, what you've already got existing. You can't wait for all this because you'll not be active.
Yeah, I think it's a great question to end on. If that's, I was going to say, if all the panelists give you a bit of a warning now, thinking space, just to get to respond to that. So, there's things that where we want to get to. What are the things now that you think would be your top thing that we should do now that starts to grow a bit of trust and make a difference in people's lives now? Because that's a challenge, isn't it? And that might, but yeah, I'm going to leave it as that.
That's fine. I'm just saying.
It's a good, given the reality of where we are. Go on, you've nodded, so I'm going to.
Parking enforcement. That's a massive one. Clearing pavements of parked cars and cars parked around junctions badly. I live.
I feel your anger there. In the room too.
So I live on an estate in Cheadle. Dave knows this. It was the Active Neighbourhood estate around Boundary Estate, and it got knocked back because a small group of residents were massively opposed to it. And yet you walk around that estate and parking's huge. It's a massive problem. It's not a wealthy estate. and yet most houses, I'm speculating, but most houses have more than one car and they don't have the space for it. And there's a lot of people with vans, and there's places where I struggle to get through. And you imagine people with wheelchairs, with buggies, anyone with any sort of mobility issues, it must be a nightmare. So that would enable people to just get out and move and walk about.
There we go. Parking enforcement. Any hands up who would support number one priority now? Yeah, a lot of support there. Okay, Eve.
I think maybe, like you were saying, for that, a lot of things are very, far away and in the future and big and maybe a bit woolly at times. I think maybe for the immediate stuff is maybe a bit more dialogue and a bit more honesty. So some honesty about things, not just about all these great things are going to happen. Maybe some honesty about the things that can't happen and maybe why would be, I think, helpful for residents and communities. They're not necessarily expecting everything, and maybe a bit more honesty from services and organisations about we can't do that right now, but we're going to do this, and being a bit more pinning themselves down a little bit more to the short term as well as those really big long plans as well would maybe help people make some decisions in the immediate, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. Dialogue, honesty, Ben.
Yeah, so I think what needs to happen in the immediate is the type of stuff you're doing, Joan, like we do in the community, just needs to continue. We do have to make do with what we've got for now. Speaking before about how we're trying to fit things in retrospectively into a world that largely wasn't designed for some of these things. So I think we've just got to keep doing what we're doing. And then I would like to see, I really liked Eve consultation process that she was sort of shared before, and I think it'd be brilliant if that was adopted by local authorities, so that it really engage with the communities in understanding, because time and time again we see schemes rush through, not done proper consultation. It's been a tick box and it just doesn't work. So it's just an inefficient use of time and spend. And just for that initial consultation, that does take a bit longer. You'd have a community and neighbourhood that works for more people. So
I think mine, I'm not sure exactly how you would do this, but would be focusing on that, getting the basics right for walking, whether you could do something around incremental change rather than having to go through the large scale scheme processes that happen with kind of bigger scale schemes, but things like dropped curbs, essentially like making junction miles narrower so you'd have to cross as far, are these things that you could do kind of from an equality and inclusion perspective, like it should be like this already, so what was it? And just like looking at ways we can deliver that to kind of things that no one's going to be opposed to and that will make it better for the local area.
Right.
I still said what I was going to say, which is about community engagement and conversations. And I think that's really important, isn't it? That's what's coming out of this, is we need to do more of it. We need to still be more effective and a bit smarter, and think there's loads of actual practical examples of what we should be doing. But the other thing is, is looking at this funding and maybe, how we frame funding, where we get funding from. Maybe that's more an immediate thing. Is there pots, small little pots that don't take a long time, this big capital year-on-year things, and have all different things,
The politician in the room, I'd say less ribbon snipping, gold shiny things, and more fixing our pavements and getting some of the basic stuff right. Thank you, everybody. Massive thank you to Ian and Graham, obviously, for doing the research. Look forward to the final report and findings, and to making sure that it doesn't sit on a shelf. This is about learning and putting this into action, all of us in our different roles. Thank you to everyone who's come and contributed and been happy to answer questions, however hard. And thank you to all of you for coming and for all the work that you all do, in your different roles, and as citizens of place. To take a lead and to challenge and hold to account. So thank you, and I hope your onward journeys are joyful and hopeful and safe. Take care. Thanks to everyone online who stuck with us.